On our show over the years, I've often done interviews with writers and authors who have a connection to the state of Vermont, or in some cases, maybe an author has written a book about a Vermont figure or another Vermont writer identified with this state and the region. A show I did in 2017, for example, focused on Dorothy Canfield Fisher, a famous author, short stories from Arlington, Vermont. And it's pretty easy to think back to a famous historic poet identified with Shaftesbury. That's Robert Frost. And he spent a period of time residing in Shaftesbury, Vermont. But today I'm talking with James Kruse, who is a poet and writer, I like to think, from Vermont's new generation. And James has some appearances coming up during 2018 at Northshire Books, our famous bookstore in Manchester, Vermont. And James, you're also associated with a college, correct?
Yes, I teach at Community College of Vermont and Southern Vermont College, both actually.
And what are some of the courses that you offer there?
I teach courses in research methods, English composition, but in my classes I'm often blending traditional writing with writing poetry, letter writing, different kinds of genres, just to get the students a little more interested in writing.
Well, to give our audience a little of your background, I know that besides earning a PhD, you've won a number, you're a recipient of a number of awards, right, and recognitions?
Yeah, so I won the Prairie Schooner Prize for my first collection of poetry, The Book of What Stays, and that was major for me because it was $3,000, and at the time I was living paycheck to paycheck, so that was a lot of money, and it just kind of gave me recognition and confidence that I could finally call myself a poet because I was published. And I've been lucky enough to win a couple of other awards. There was a fund, the Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Fund, for a long time that gave rather substantial awards for poetry that was kind of focused on spiritual matters. And that is one of the things that I tend to write a lot about. So I sent a couple of poems to them, and one poem won $10,000. And then another poem a couple of years later won, I think, $7,500. So writing poetry for me, luckily, has been pretty lucrative over the years. It's not quite enough to make a living, but I've been very lucky with the awards. And what I tell students and people who are interested in writing is that you just have to try for everything that's out there because you never know what's going to happen.
I'm assuming that there are known contests and competitions for poetry that you can submit, right? And what's the lay of the land with that?
Well, so in order to publish poetry, typically what you need to do nowadays is actually to win one of these contests. Often they're through university presses or small presses, and they offer a few $1,000s in most cases. And so that's how you get a book of poetry published. Because books of poetry don't really sell very much, you're not usually getting an agent for one of those books, although a number of poets who are maybe interested in writing memoir or move over to fiction as well, then an agent can kind of come into play and help with the publishing. But mostly it's through these kinds of contests that books of poetry get published. And so if people are interested, poets and writers, they have a great website. You can look through their contest database, lists all those different contests. And they usually cost a little bit to enter. So you might enter, 5 or 10 at a time. But again, you never know. You might get lucky.
So in some degree, through, I guess, the web and the internet, it's probably easier than ever before, right, to find out about these opportunities?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's easier than ever, I think, to find out about the opportunities to publish, but it's also easier to publish because there are a lot more online magazines. It's much easier to create a website, to create a press even, and find a distributor. All you really need is a website, and there are submission systems. So, I could sit down, I have a new manuscript that I'm getting ready to send out now, and in a day I could sit down and send off to 50 contests just online, just attaching the document and paying the fees. So it's really opened up the field in terms of, how many people can submit, but it does mean that the field is a little more crowded than I think.
So since you live in Shaftesbury, right down the road from the homestead or where Robert Frost spent some time, one of the great American poets, what you just described, compare that to his period, his time, what he would have to do as a startup poet to get going. What would he have to do?
Well, I would imagine what he did do was, just create so much correspondence with people, write to people. You send things through the mail, and you wait, and you wait, and you wait. There's still a lot of waiting involved, but I think so much of the process was making connections with real people, so getting to know people at various colleges and getting to know other friends, other people who are poets and writers, publishers. So making more in-person connections and then actually physically actually interacting with them or creating that physical correspondence between people. So he would have had to do a lot more work, I think, to actually get his work out there. But he was also operating in an environment with a lot less distraction, I think. So his period of time maybe seems a little bit more appealing to me.
I mean, when we look at it, it really isn't that long ago.
No,
maybe
it's not.
60 years, 70 years.
Yeah.
And he was doing this without a fax machine.
Absolutely.
The phone, yeah, you could call people, but making a long distance call back then was an event of sorts. And there was, I don't think there were copier machines that
Probably
were
not.
around. So I remember carbon paper, and certainly a typewriter, a manual typewriter, but he didn't have a lot of the tools that writers have available, and even to look up information, right? To you were talking about research a few minutes ago. Speak to that from years ago.
Well, I guess you would have had to have a really good set of encyclopedias, probably access to a really good library.
It is a term we don't hear too much anymore.
Library?
Right? No, well, library or encyclopedia, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge change. So now it is Wikipedia or, any number of other websites that people are using to research things. And so that's actually one of my roles as a teacher, is helping students try to determine now, with so much information at their fingertips and so much writing that can't necessarily be trusted, fake news aside, sources still have to be, credible, and you have to decide, can I listen to this person? Can I trust this person? And so in many ways, I think it's a lot easier for us, but we have an awful lot more to sift through. So I see it as, in some ways, a lot more noise and a lot more distraction. I sort of value that idea of having to work a little more to get your information, and to know that you could actually trust that information. And for me, I think writing will always be a very kind of physical, sensory experience. I still write all of my poems, really everything firsthand, longhand first, and then write them over and over on legal pad and pen, and then slowly transfer that to the computer once a poem progresses to a certain point. So I still love, just working with those physical elements of the writing process. Though I think that makes me very different from a lot of other poets working nowadays.
But even the dictionary, which is the Bible, so to speak, of words and meanings and sentence structure, has sort of been relegated or cast aside. It doesn't have that profound respect as a tool. I don't think that people, I mean, when you owned a dictionary, that as a years ago, that was something that was important. It doesn't have that status anymore, I don't think.
It doesn't, and that's, that is because you can look up anything online. There are typically dictionaries that are on each computer or laptop, or there's dictionary.com or thesaurus.com. And I love my students. They're really great, but it will come up in class that we're trying to find a word, and it seems that often they're willing to just move past it and not worry about it. And so sometimes I will stop in the middle of class and just say, why don't we look it up? This is one of those instances where you can take out your phone, use your phone, look it up, because I do think that even though there's a lot more noise and distraction out there, that's one instance where, having this dictionary, and you can look up any word, you can see the source, you can see the origin of where that word comes from. And, for most people, they would have had to have the money to buy a dictionary. They would have had to have it handy. We do have that handy. And so that's one of those ways that I think technology can be used for good.
I find today, I think years ago, there was, again, a lot more concern or a lot more attention paid to the meanings of words and the origin of words. Almost, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the study of a word. And that seems to have evaporated or gone away today among today's generation. Where they'll throw out a word or use a word, and they really don't know what the true meaning of that word is. The
true meaning, or even, the weight of a word, how much a word can affect us. Because I do feel that, all of us really, but younger people especially, they are sifting through so much more information and so many more words. They communicate for the most part via text message, or, even via photos in some instances. But there are so many words that have to be sifted through, and I think that we pretend that those words don't affect us. If someone says something negative, or even if someone says something positive, there's just not as much attention given to how much language can affect us.
And choice of words, right?
Absolutely, so. And I think, it is maybe due a lot to the climate of our country right now and where we are with politics, but, there is a desire to sort of take power away from language, I think, or, to throw out so much language that we do get distracted and that we do get lost in all of these words. But I think it's still very important to acknowledge. I mean, Maya Angelou said that words stick to things in a room. They stick to people, they stick to objects. And I think that's absolutely true. I couldn't prove that, but I know, if someone says something to me, it stays with me, especially if it's, a compliment or a cutting insult.
I'm concerned, James Cruz, about, again, today's culture, that the art, the skill of writing, communication through the written word is declining. It's not being prioritized and emphasized in schools and in education and learning. We're losing this. It's giving way to this thing. And you talked about texting and Twittering and all of these things, and they're the rage. And I suspect that, in ancient civilizations that, hieroglyphics were the rage at that time, like maybe Twitter is today.
Right.
But I'm concerned about the lack of emphasis and priority in education today in our schools about the written word, compositions, letter writing.
Right. Yeah.
Your thoughts on that?
I'm concerned as well. I think that it's very difficult for the written word, especially for something that seems as quiet as a poem, to compete with a text message from your friend, or a Facebook message, or someone's tweet, or even I think of Instagram, which is all photos, as the modern day equivalent of hieroglyphics, because it's just communication via image in so many cases. So I'm concerned too, but I do think that that's where poetry can come in, because it is language that's been paid so much attention to. It's language that is attempting to distill image and feeling and moments in time that have affected a single consciousness. So I think that is where poems can, if they are accessible, if people can understand them, which I think is sort of a separate problem, that there's a lot of that kind of poetry being written that people can't necessarily understand. But if those poems that are more accessible make it into the hands of people, I believe it can teach us all to pay closer attention to our lives, right down to, a scuffed table or a glass of water in the sunlight. It can all be magical. It just depends on how much attention we give to it.
So, James Cruz, why is it important for our academic educational community to lead on the written word and written communication as we've traditionally known it in our lifetime?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important because, so much begins with language. Someone pointed out to me recently that, in the Nazi era in Germany, one of the ways in which Jews were sort of demonized and dehumanized was the word that was used to describe them, Übermenschen, under people, like less than human. And so I think we just have to pay close attention to how we use language and how language is used to talk about, especially our fellow humans, other people. And so I think the academic world has to lead in pointing out to students, to this next generation that is so consumed with words that don't have as much weight or meaning, that we can revise, we can pay very close attention to the language we use, and we can give it that weight. And so, in my teaching, I'm often teaching argument, I'm teaching rhetorical strategies, and it's very related to what I do in a poem. My goal is to try to convince someone this is worthy of your attention, this is really important. And so I try to train students to do the same thing with their writing. There are strategies we can use. And typically, it is that paying attention over time to the language that allows something to gather enough power or force to change minds or to change people. And so I think language is the frontier where so much is going to happen with this next generation. Anyone who can use language well and who can convince people, hopefully, of, honorable and worthy things, these are the people who are going to succeed and who are going to lead the country.
Technology is usurping the written word and language. And when we look at technology through history, and again, the revolution that's taking place now, the changing business model in publishing and writing, publishing as it affects books, as it affects magazines and newspapers, as it affects bookstores like Northshire Books or
Sure.
Barnes and Noble or whatever. But when we look throughout history, when we go back to the Gutenberg printing press in the Middle Ages, right, and how that was a form of technology that transformed communication and the
Absolutely.
written word, and it
Yeah.
opened many opportunities and doors for authors and writers. It took them to a new level,
Right. Absolutely.
but can technology be used today to support and embrace the written word?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways. I think the rise of ebooks has been great. It's not my preferred method of reading. I still prefer that sensory experience of holding a book, and a lot of people I know do. But it means that a lot more information in distilled form can reach a lot more people. And so that's always going to be a positive. And people can use their phones to read articles, to read books. And many people I know, well-educated, who care about the same things, they are using their phones to read books. I think that's great. But I think another way in which technology can be used to support, the spread of ideas or the spread of poetry can be, inserting some poetry into a Facebook feed. I mean, that's my form of activism. I'll often just copy and paste a poem into my, status and, see how people respond to that. See if that's a moment for them that kind of invites them to slow down and be quiet and sit with that language. So I think finding these little ways, whether it's doing things like that or, creating a meme that has a quote from your favorite poem, a blog or a website, there are lots of ways that poetry can spread. And, I have a blog, singingbowl.org, where I publish poems that I think are spiritually relevant, that, again, invite people to slow down a little bit and, pay closer attention to their lives. And so I think technology can support us. I'm just not sure that we're all using it in the ways that it could best support that.
To be an author for many, many decades was a struggle to get published.
Sure.
You had to go to the publishing houses. It was an industry that was somewhat tightly controlled.
Yes.
Maybe there was some variations through university presses or presses that were vanity presses. But today it's less expensive and more versatile than ever before to get for a publisher or someone who wants to get published, right, and started.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Self-publishing.
Yeah. So self-publishing is very big now, and it's something that I myself have considered, just because it is so much easier. The design possibilities are so much greater now. So you can create a really attractive book for yourself for very little money, and and make money yourself from selling and distributing it. Amazon has a service that you can publish your own books. Northshire Bookstore has
They have a whole program, right?
Absolutely,
Northshire Books, right?
They do, and it's an amazing program where I teach as well. Southern Vermont College. Students who are interested actually can take a class where basically they write a book and then create it through the Northshire program. And so they come out of undergrad college with a book already published, which is more than most people can say. So I think it's another thing that's really widening the field for writers and giving them a chance to share their work that would not have been there in Frost's time, and even 20 or 30 years ago wouldn't have been possible.
And it's really, I think, in technology, a groove now that's been established, so that there's a format that's relatively easy to engage and exercise on self-publishing if someone wants to pursue it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So now these events at Northshire Books, and I know you've done them at a couple of other places. I think you did them up in Rutland, Vermont recently. What's going on there at Northshire Books that you're involved with?
Well, I love talking about this and Northshire Bookstore because I feel that, in our part of Vermont here, we have basically this world-class bookstore that attracts amazing people to read there. So when I first moved here, I got in touch with them and, I had this idea for, just holding a one-day mindfulness and writing workshop. And so, I asked them, would you be interested in hosting this? They were more than willing. And so it began this whole series of mindfulness workshops that I've been doing there throughout the last year. And I'm starting to do online mindfulness workshops so that people in our area or in other areas who may not want to get out as much in the winter can still take the workshops. They're very simple. Basically, all you need is email to do them. And so that's been a pleasure. And the mindfulness piece is really important for me because I do feel that writing is one form of mindfulness practice. It's certainly one form for me. And so the collaboration with Northshire has been amazing, and they've just been accommodating from the start. And I also run a free mindfulness and writing group that meets, I believe it's going to be the second Saturday of every month at Northshire Bookstore.
James Kruse has two books, Telling My Father, and also the Book of What Stays. And I'm assuming these would be available through Northshire Books well, right?
Yes.
So, and James Kruse, in our closing couple of minutes, why don't you read a little bit from Telling My Father? Why don't you give us a poem or two from that book?
Okay. Well, I'll read Telling My Father, which is the title poem. And this was a poem about basically a moment when I had wanted to come out to my father, but didn't exactly know how. And this is one of those moments of connection that I'm really interested in with poetry. So this is Telling My Father. I found him on the porch that morning, sipping cold coffee, watching a crow dip down from the power line into the pile of black bags stuffed in the dumpster, where he pecked and snagged a can tab, then carried it off, clamped in his beak like the key to a room only he knew about. My father turned to me then, taking in the reek of my smoke, traces of last night's eyeliner I decided not to wipe off this time. Out late was all he said, and then smiled, rubbing the small of my back through the robe for a while before heading inside, letting the storm door click shut behind him. Later, when I stepped into the kitchen, I saw it waiting there on the table, a glass of orange juice he had poured for me and left, sweating in a patch of sunlight so bright I couldn't touch it at first.
James Kruse from Shaftesbury, Vermont, poet and writer and educator at Southern Vermont College. We'll be probably hearing more about this new generation writer and poet from Shaftesbury, Vermont. And I want to thank you for being our guest, and I would urge our viewers to certainly do the online writing course that James Kruse is offering through Northshire Books. And thank you very much for being with us. This is Danny Frank for GNAT TV.